I am here on the campus of Cal Poly Humboldt here in Humboldt County, California. Now, in this very plaza, almost 60 years ago, 3,000 to 4,000 students and faculty gathered for the largest one-day political protest in the history of this campus, and among the largest ever to occur in Humboldt County up to now. At the time, this was known as Sequoia Plaza, on the campus of what was then known as Humboldt State College. Today, we're going to journey back to that charged moment in time, the anti-Vietnam War movement as it occurred here in Humboldt County in the late 1960s and early 70s. We will meet some of the students who stood on this very ground and raised their voices against the Vietnam War. So, I invite you to join me as we explore the legacy of resistance, courage, and community that was born almost 60 years ago, right here in Humboldt, outdoors.
As U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War intensified in the late 1960s, voices of dissent grew louder across college campuses nationwide. On May 6, 1970, more than 3,000 students and faculty gathered at Humboldt State College and voted to enact a one-week boycott of classes so they could focus on anti-Vietnam War efforts. They called their boycott a strike for peace.
And I think here, thinking about the war going on and saying, we get to have a say about this because you're expecting our young men to go fight that war.
And people were opening the San Francisco Chronicle with headlines that students had been shot at Kent State, protesting the war. And there was a sense that the war was coming home and they were aiming the guns at us.
And it was clear to me early on that the war was a disaster and had to come to an end, and we needed to get our troops out. And there were a lot of people locally that I felt the same way and joined me in this effort.
Now, several years prior to the 1970 strike for peace, local concern about the United States escalating involvement in the Vietnam War was stirring, including right here at Arcata High School. And to find out more about that, I had a chance to meet with Zach Swerdling, who was a student here at the time.
I was active at Arcata High School. I was a student there from 65 to 69, and around 66, 67, I started educating myself about the war, reading a lot about it, and concluded pretty early on that it was a disaster and needed to come to an end. Every chance I had to get up and speak to my fellow students, I would do so against the war. And I do recall making a statement. It was in, I think, a civics class perhaps, and just giving some history of the war and why I thought the war was not in the best interests of the country. And I got called into the vice principal's office and reprimanded for it. And again, I was proud of it. Because obviously what I said had an impact on whoever was listening.
Zach's activism didn't end here at Arcata High School. He explained to me that he and some other high school students took their anti-Vietnam War messaging out into the community.
A number of us would go to the plaza frequently, typically on Saturdays, non-school days, to hand out anti-war literature. There were moratorium demonstrations in San Francisco, and I helped organize busloads of students, including Arcata High students, to go to those demonstrations. And so one of the things we did was go to the Arcata City Council. I was the presenter, and we asked the City Council to endorse an anti-war moratorium that was voted down. Arcata City Council was very conservative. I knew that. I knew the vote wasn't going to happen. But I walked out feeling like I'd done something. There's a news story about it, and everybody who read that news story began to realize, hey, there are people in this community who want this war to come to an end, and we're doing everything we can peacefully to make that happen.
Okay, now let's head back to the Cal Poly Humboldt campus to explore how the anti-Vietnam War movement was growing on campus in the late 1960s, leading up to the 1970 strike for peace. Let's go. While Zach and the other students at Arcata High were taking their anti-war activism out into the community, students here at Humboldt State College were also feeling a growing need to speak out against the war. To learn more about that, I met with Katie Taya, who wrote a book called Humboldt State University, a history book which includes a chapter on the anti-Vietnam War movement here on campus. Katie began attending as a student of Humboldt State College here in 1967.
Everybody was listening from what we could get of what was coming up out of the Bay Area. And I think for the student body here was striving for a way that our opinions could become known. It was a 6-hour drive to San Francisco or Berkeley, where a lot of activities were taking place. So what we did was very centered on just our own little corner of the world.
Okay, I think this is the spot. Based on an old 1966 picture in Katie's book, this is about the location where an old redwood stump was set up by the Forestry Club. And I'll let Katie tell you the interesting story about how that redwood stump was used by the students.
We had an object on the Humboldt State campus called the Speaker's Stump. It was our little corner of free speech in the middle of the Humboldt State campus. So you never knew when you walked by the stump who was going to be saying what. If you wanted to talk about the fact that you thought the war was the stupidest thing that the United States government had ever involved itself in, you could say that.
What really set this protest era apart from others is there was a lot at stake for the male students who attended here.
As women, we didn't need to worry about getting snagged to go fight in a war in Vietnam. But we had a world of concern for our gentlemen friends. The young men had to keep at least a C average in college. And if you did not maintain a C average, you could be available for the draft. And I think it's almost a reflection of that time in the 70s when people were looking for a way to make the world better and who were interested in saying, what can we do peaceably and collectively to change the way our nation is going?
The first large protest against the Vietnam War in Humboldt County originated from right here on this campus on October 15th, 1969, when around 800 students marched from here down to Arcata Plaza. It was part of the national moratorium to end the war in Vietnam. After that, they continued their protests and activities into Eureka. At the time, this was a fairly conservative community, and their message was not real well received in either Arcata or Eureka. However, there was no violence whatsoever associated with the march or all the protest activities that occurred that day.
The people I was involved with, both at the high school and at Humboldt State, were peaceful. Everything was peaceful. We didn't break any rules. We didn't break any laws. We were respectful. We wanted to be like Martin Luther King. We wanted this to be a nonviolent change. We didn't want to offend or alienate people by advocating violence. We understood that the people who opposed us had their reasons, and we were respectful of that.
Everybody was, let's keep it peaceful, let's talk to one another, let's not give the cops any reason to be peeved at us.
Other campuses didn't take that approach. They were self-proclaimed revolutionaries. They wanted to firebomb buildings. They wanted to throw bricks through windows. And I'm really proud of this community for being the way it is, and it's a little oasis in a green sea of community spirit, and I think we're really lucky to live here.
In early May 1970, the United States invasion of Cambodia and the killing of 4 Kent State student protesters by the National Guard sent shockwaves throughout this nation.
This war is just going on, and it's getting worse and worse and bigger, and now they're starting to shoot students on college campuses. And we all just kind of felt this, a little bit of a bitterness, but also just an increase in our desire to see this thing come to an end. It just had to come to an end.
On May 5th, 1970, one day after the student protesters had been shot on Kent State University campus, this theater filled with students who met to try to figure out how they could come together in solidarity to take meaningful action. Now, I had a chance to meet with two former students who attended the meeting in here. One was Katie, and the other is retired California State Senator Wesley Chesborough. And they said that this theater was charged with emotional intensity during that meeting.
I remember that energy. There was just a really powerful sense that we had to do something, that we couldn't just sit by and watch. And that led to the student body president, Bill Richardson, calling a campus meeting at what's now the Van Duzer. It was called the Sequoia Theater at the time. And it was packed. And there was an hours-long discussion about what to do. And there was an agreement to call a rally for the next day to try to bring the student body together.
Every seat in the theater, the hallways, the floor going down into it was just on the stage, crammed with students.
So not only were we very aware that we were at risk of being asked to go fight the war, but now the war was actually coming home and coming to us. And that was really the spark that began the discussion, really rapid series of events that led to the student strike at Humboldt State.
So May 6th was the day of the big rally right here in this quad. It was moderated by Bill Richardson, who was a student body president, and Catherine Corbett, who was the faculty president. They gave each student who wanted to speak about 3 minutes to talk. It took about 4 hours to get through all the speakers.
I showed up and was just astonished and completely blown away by how many people were there.
The biggest count I have seen is 3,800 people in that thing, which at that point was probably the biggest non-sports crowd we'd ever had making an opinion about anything. I mean, they'd had gatherings there before, like when Martin Luther King was assassinated, there was a gathering in that space, but it didn't have 3,800 people in it.
And so then there was a series of speakers. There was a can that got passed around to collect draft cards. I think somebody actually burned their draft card. And that energy of that moment powered student involvement. When Becky and the other singer, I don't remember his name, Becky Evans, and he started singing, everybody joined hands, and there was a real sense of unity to the music to channel that energy into a real emotional, positive sense of empowerment.
Music was a big part of the anti-war movement, and many musicians and groups were speaking out against the war and making music with lyrics that spoke to us about what was happening in our world. They projected this whole feeling of community and end war and try to get along with each other and basically love. That was their message. And I think that resonated really well with most of the people in the anti-war movement.
So after the final speaker, student body president Bill Richardson stood up and presented a resolution which had been previously approved by the Student Legislative Council. That resolution included two key measures. Number one is that students here would go on a 1-week strike from classes so that they could go out into the community and conduct anti-war activism and activities. Number two is that this campus would send a delegation to Washington, D.C. to let legislators there know how this campus felt about the Vietnam War.
Well, Bill Richardson got up and said, we need to see if this really represents you, the students, and the majority view of the students. And so he called for a vote on whether or not we should shut the campus down as a protest to the war. And I mean, it was unanimous. Every single person raised their hands, raised their fists, and held their vote. It was really a profound moment.
And the students stood up and they voted yes, let's strike for peace.
And so the activities moved off of campus. And one of the things that happened was that the owner of Northtown Books, Jerry Gorsline, offered to set it up as a strike headquarters for organizing further activities.
There's a group of people in one corner making t-shirts for people. There's a group of people in the other corner with precinct records passing out addresses. There's somebody in the other corner going, who's going to speak at the meeting tonight? So it was a madhouse inside the bookstore.
There was a decision to go out and walk door to door in various communities on the North Coast and organize that as an activity. They were given out assignments for different neighborhoods. And then there was a subsequent gathering, I think it was called a teach-in at Arcata High School, where there was further discussions by various folks on different aspects of the war, different ways of organizing, different strategies. It was a pretty conservative community, but there were a handful of downtown business people who really appreciated and supported what we were doing.
There was a statue of President McKinley in the middle of the plaza at that period of time in Arcata. And we were singing protest songs. So somebody climbed up on McKinley's statue, hung on his arm, because McKinley had his arm up or whatever. So they're hanging on to McKinley's arm, and they're leading the choir singing songs, hanging off the top of McKinley's statue in the middle of the plaza.
The one picture of me is of me hanging on to the McKinley statue, leading the crowd in the anti-war Country Joe and the Fish protest song. The lyrics go 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
Men were running towards long hair at the time. So one of the things that was decided is that a group of the men said, we'll cut our hair.
I think students cutting their hair and walking door to door and showing respect really went a long, long ways.
We were very peaceful here, very respectful of other people's opinions. And this community, Arcata, switched dramatically, 180-degree turn, and with people like Wes Chesbrough and Julie Fulkerson, all these great folks that were early on anti-war people, then became the stewards of this change in the politics and the direction the community was taking.
With a lot of the energy coming out of the student strike, a group of us decided to run 3 candidates for the Arcata City Council in 1972. We were able to get 2 of those candidates elected.
The city and the community became, I think, more engaged in the world around us. The environmental movement was getting off the ground, and this was sort of a hub of environmentalism.
That student involvement and the feeling that we could really make a difference on the scale of community that we have here caused many students to graduate and stay. And I think that also transformed the culture here, that we had to be constructive and support positive alternatives, and not simply be trying to drag things down. And I think that sense of empowerment and engagement grew originally directly out of that strike.
The student protests showed us how to work collectively as a group and make change in the world, contribute towards the good of the general public. And I think we learned that here in Humboldt in the 60s and the 70s.